We are experiencing major changes in the commodity market, regardless of which scenario you're looking into, whether it is a net zero scenario driven primarily by utilization of lower sources of carbon and potentially more sustainable, or if you're looking at a scenario that I consider business as usual, for instance, where you still incorporate fossil fuels such as the crude oil in the energy mix of a specific country, for instance. Um, we are going through a period where the short-term events, which are currently happening in the market, they have a lot more weight. They can shape the outlook for the remaining of the year, and if not, for the years to come. One of the major or one of the most obvious commodity that has been heavily affected and shaped by the current events, it's the crude oil. The crude oil is a perfect reflection of what is happening in the market, and it provides a good benchmark for the outlook for in the commodity market, because on one side it reflects the supply and demand current conditions in the market, and on the other side crude oil also reflects emerging technologies such as sustainable renewable, because we always spoke about curbing emissions from fossil fuels such as crude oil and even natural gas at the expense of innovative, sustainable, and more secure sources of energy. If we look at the main drivers for the crude oil market, we're talking mainly supply and demand, we're talking products demand, and also geopolitical impact in the pricing of the commodity. And that is also true for the commodity market, and that's basically what shapes the commodity market: supply and demand, geopolitics, and all these factors, they come together and they formulate the right price, which OPEC tends to set based on the right supply, if there's supply in the market, to meet demand. It's also important to understand how we got to the current prices for crude, because if we are in a business as usual scenario where we assume that crude is still pretty much part of our day-to-day routine, then what we are saying here is that if we can look at where the prices were pre-COVID, we can see that there was already an element of demand destruction. Prices were low, and those prices, they were exacerbated by extreme COVID measures, which completely destroyed or exacerbated that slim demand that the market was already experiencing. Major ports had to close their routes to cargoes, and they were not only for crude but also for products. Crude being used mainly for industrialization purposes, where you convert that into usable fractions or into usable products like gasoline and diesel. And given that a lot of countries which are main importers of crude had to experience a curfew or a complete lockdown, so there was no driving around, there was no flying around, so products like jet fuel were also saw their demand reduced. Products like gas or diesel, which are used in for industrial purposes, they were majorly affected as well. So when we looked at the overall impact of crude shipments in a global scale, then we can see that it is a good gauge for other commodities as well. Looking at natural gas, for instance, which is used for power generation. Natural gas in this instance, there is a major current event that is happening in the market when we look at Russia and Ukraine. Russia being one of the main suppliers of gas into Europe now. Following this invasion as of the 22nd of Feb, Europe is ramping up all the necessary measures to ensure that it can go into a period where there is a secure supply of gas to continue to heat up the homes post-COVID. So from let's say around April 2020, we started to see some signs of demand recovery. So the price of crude, which tanked all the way down to 18 or so dollars per barrel by March, April 2020. From then onwards, we started to see a slow but gradual increase in demand. And the most recent events, they actually shaped the commodity market in such a way that Brent crude went from $80 per barrel, which at the time was already considered to be overvalued, all the way to 139, close to 140 in recent weeks. So the last 2 weeks they've been detrimental for energy the energy sector, and it raised a lot of speculation of whether we still need, or whether we can actually eliminate crude completely from the energy sector. And of course, looking at the benchmark for crude itself, in which countries like Guyana, for example, which has recently, as of around 2020, increased the major plans for revamping the crude oil industry with Liza crude cargo, which is a sweet, light to medium grade of crude oil. With this current environment, this Liza crude coming out of Guyana, we can find new markets. You can find new markets in China, you can find new markets in Europe, and you can find new markets in the US Gulf Coast, because refiners will try to look for that light to medium sweet grade of crude, given that the US, the grade of Liza crude can be used for diesel production, whereas in Europe, in Europe tends to import crude for gasoline production, especially being benchmarked to Brent, and Brent being a good candidate for gasoline production. Then countries like Guyana can definitely find new markets in Europe. So as for the outlook for the commodity market, it's hard to predict with a high level of certainty. But one thing that we can actually use is the crude oil market to gauge the developments